The talk I'm going to give is on how Australian orchids have had an involvement, continue to have an involvement in our human lives. And thankfully, it's got nothing to do with COVID, except for the fact that, well, I'm going to talk about how it's affected us a few times. So if we look at how Australian orchids interact with the humans, that is us, we can split it into two different groups. We can split things into natural and also into cultivation. So when we're talking about interactions in the natural world, we're talking about assessing habitat condition, habitat management, threatened species, things that basically we can use orchids for as a means of understanding the environment in which we occur. If we look at cultivation, we've got the use of orchids as flowering plants, as pot plants, but also too as garden plants. And more we're seeing some of our orchids slip into landscape use. So as horticultural pursuits and as cultivated plants, these are the main reason we are meeting tonight. We have, as a group, decided that these plants hold a fascination for us, and we want to grow them and hopefully grow them well. This leads to the social benefits of groups, which, as we all found out recently, can go missing when you can't actually manage to get together as a group. And it's nice to see, as I said, that we've found some technological workarounds. Why native orchids though? Well, they give us a wide array of flowers, both in shapes, colours, sizes, in several bursts through the year. We have in summer some of the terrestrial orchids coming through, things like swamp orchid and the calanthe, the Christmas orchid, come through into autumn, and we get the Dendrobium bigibbum influenced hybrids, so North Queensland influenced Dendrobiums, and of course the hot colds that are bred from them. Go into winter, we get a lot of terrestrials. And then into spring, we come up with first the Dendrocarinae, the classic Australian Dendrobiums. And then further on, as spring progresses towards summer, we get into the Sarcochilus and start seeing some of those come through. But the main way they are starting to appear more and more, and this is with thanks to a number of the nurseries that have been taking the time to cultivate it, they're coming up as potted colour. So that plant on the previous slide that Scott Barry had produced is an example of the sort of potted colour we're seeing some of our native orchids start to contribute towards. It doesn't all have to be just great big fluffy flowers. So let's look at some of the natural habitats in which the orchids occur and the orchids in which I've encountered, or the habitat I've encountered orchids. So we have here a paperbark swamp forest, which occurs in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland, close to the coast, low altitudes, and usually a haven for various biting insects. However, it's also a bit of a haven for our largest ground orchid, the Steenbeeke, the swamp orchid, but also too a number of epiphytes that both occur on the paperbarks and on the other trees that are within it. So what do some of these plants look like? Well, Dendrobium tetragonum is one. It's a brightly coloured, although small member of the Dendrobium tetragonum group, the classic type of the variety of the species. The plant's usually about 50 centimetres to 80 centimetres across, with stems 30 to 60 centimetres long. It'll flower for many years off the same stem with these richly coloured flowers that are also strong in perfume. Similar to that, we get Dendrobium melaleucaphilum, which can be distinguished by these broad labellum lobes, mid-lobes that it has, which the previous one, tetragonum, doesn't show so clearly. It's also a much larger plant. But when I talk about its dual role, melaleucaphilum is listed in New South Wales as an endangered species. So finding this species in the habitat in which it occurs can actually cause an increased amount of assessment when it comes to how a development may impact on the habitat in which it occurs. And this certainly happened for things like the Pacific Highway upgrade. Dendrobium teretifolium is another species which is very common in these swamp forests and indeed along much of the coast, not just in the paper barks, but also too on the she oaks, the casuarinas that line the waterways. The flowers themselves are reasonably nondescript, usually about 4 to 6 centimetres across, sort of ivory to sometimes a fairly stark white, with a very curly labellum. But when a plant flowers, as you can see from the plant on the right-hand side there, it absolutely covers itself in flowers. This is the plant that's at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney. It's probably the most publicly accessible orchid in the Botanic Gardens in Sydney. It is huge. It's bigger than me, and every year flowers like this, and it'll be in flower again, if not at the moment, then certainly within the next couple of weeks. Oberonia complanata is another threatened species that occurs in these lowland swampy habitats, but also too in higher altitudes where it occurs in cloud forest when it crosses the border into Queensland. There's about 4 or 5 locations for this species that are known in New South Wales and another 2 that are presumed. But the species itself can act, again, as a trigger for an elevated amount of threatened species assessment. This is another one which also led to a minor deviation of the new highway. Then we look at some of these elevated subtropical rainforests. So this is your classic northern New South Wales, climbing up into the mountains. In fact, this is at Dorrigo. Climbing up into the mountains, you get these dense forests, wet forests that have very few orchids on the ground. And in those cases, usually orchids that don't need chlorophyll because, as you can imagine from the density of the canopy there, there's not much light going to the ground. So things like Danhatchia and Galliola and, Erythrorchis and Epipogium and Gastrodia are species that you'll find under the canopy, growing in the leaf litter and the soil under the trees. But in the trees themselves, you end up with a wide array of epiphytes, and especially when these forests start getting into the cloud forest levels where you get your cloud deck forming as the water vapor in the air condenses. Things like Bulbophyllum schillerianum, which has this rich coloured labellum in flowers that have the texture of plastic. A large plant can be 50 or 60 centimetres across. Generally, you don't find them that large, and usually you only find large plants like that on those wind-thrown giant trees that come down after storms. The species itself gives you a good example of how the habitat is operating, how well it is handling any changes. And this is something that we need to particularly consider with these cloud forest communities is as the globe warms and the air warms, the cloud deck, the point at which the cloud actually starts to form, is itself rising up the mountains. So the lower altitude sections of the habitat for this species are becoming increasingly unfavourable. But a large plant suggests that it's been there for a long time, and certainly when you get large numbers of plants, as you do in some places along the Tweed Range near Mount Warning, you'll get these plants doing very well. Sarcochilus falcatus is one that is also found right through these rainforest communities and indeed out into some of the wider, drier situations, or at least brighter situations, because they're not usually drier. As a sarc, the plant has no real storage organs, so it relies on regular moisture, whether that be as cloud or as rain. And the species itself occurs from eastern Victoria all the way through to the Atherton tableland, so it's really tolerant of a wide range of conditions. Bulbophyllum argyropus, a species which was originally described from Lord Howe and Norfolk Islands, but was then found near Dorrigo and has since been found further south near Mount Seaview, is another species which allows us to not only look at how the habitat is behaving, but also to at this concept called island biogeography, where species jump between islands, and there are minor differences between the mainland and the island forms of this species, but they still show this very typical wartiness along the inflorescence, and the fact that the flowers do actually present at an odd angle to the raceme. That is actually how they appear. So Don't expect it to ever look like it's got all the flowers sitting up properly, because it'll never do it. This is a small species. It's only about 4 or 5 centimetres tall as a plant, with the raceme to about 7 or 8 centimetres long at most, and occurs in those very high altitude cloud forest situations. This is a species that we will have to watch as we end up with that cloud change that I mentioned before. Dendrobium falcorostrum is another species which is occurring at these high altitude in the beech forests that occur from the Barrington Tops just north of Newcastle through to just across the Queensland border. The species occurs as a natural plant only on Antarctic beech, Nothofagus murray, which is a tall tree in the cloud forests. The species falcorostrum has contributed a lot to our breeding, with very round white flowers, a very prominent labellum with the hook on the front that gives it that name, falcon beak, falcorostrum, but also has contributed a lot to the ability of a plant to present a scent. This is a very richly scented species and is often found in the wild by nose before eye. If we go down in the altitudes into some of these drier gullies, you can see the forest opens out, you get more light towards the ground. You also get a different suite of species. You get those that are more tolerant of drying conditions and occasionally unfavourable long dry spells, but also too, you get plants which grow fast and die young because they're behaving in a way in which they'll take advantage of conditions that suit the growth of the plant while it's there, but then as soon as they're no longer able to persist, they die off and rely on a few individuals stuck in refugia. This habitat also tends to have a lot more of your classic terrestrials, so you'll see things like Pterostylis and Corybus and Achianthus occurring in places around this habitat. When I talk about these live fast, die young plants, this is probably the best example. Plectoriza tridentata, tangleroot orchid, which that example there shows well why it's named as such, can be quite precocious and will flower within 3 years of seed germinating in the wild, and even less in cultivation. It's again a good example of an assessment of habitat condition, because as a twig epiphyte, often you find the plant more frequently on the ground than in the canopy itself. So if you're finding the plant, you know that at various stages the community has been in a conditioned state that allows the plant to get established. It can also act a bit as a way of telling you that the conditions aren't particularly terrific, because if you see a lot of plants on the ground, it also suggests that the trees are starting to shed their canopy. Sarcochilus olivaceus, which is a related species also occurring in these gullies, these drier gullies, however, generally occurs mostly as a lithophyte, can occur as an epiphyte. It also has this habit, as you can see here, of the leaves bowing down, which keeps the rain out of the crown of the plant so the plant doesn't end up dying from crown rot, but also too means that the flowers get hidden underneath the foliage. So that's a short raceme for this species. It can easily have 10 to 14 flowers on a good raceme on a very healthy plant, but often you'll see them in the wild with 8 to 10 flowers. Flowers are quite large and again reasonably scented. When it comes to the drier habitats, and here we have a classic around Sydney sandstone dry habitat, you can see here we've got 3 clumps, large clumps of Dendrobium speciosum clinging to this eastern cliff face. It faces east, which means that it gets morning sun, but is usually out of the main heat of the afternoon, so the plants can persist. They'll germinate in a small bed of moss on the rock. As we know, speciosum is a very slow grower, so that gives it the opportunity to persist. And with its large pseudobulbs, as you can see here, there's one there, another one there, it's got the opportunity to store moisture for when conditions aren't really as good as they can be. These are probably among the westernmost of all the Dendrobium speciosums found in nature. I'm standing literally on the Great Dividing Range. The water behind me flows to Adelaide. The water in front of me flows down to the Hawkesbury River. So it's right on the Great Dividing Range, but it's still only at about 600 metres altitude, so this is a lower part of the range. Speciosum has got a lot of history in our hybridizing. It produces a lot of flowers. They're large, they have good texture. They tend to last reasonably well. You get 2-3 weeks out of them. But also too, it can be very showy in flower with a lot of racemes bearing a lot of flowers. As a result, the plants are often grown around Sydney, and you'll see it in some of the older gardens around Sydney, as garden plants growing on a rock or a log or stuck in the fork of a tree, where the plant persists with minimal care but provides this great display at the start of September every year. Dendrobium kingianum is another lithophyte that occurs, that's a rock orchid, occurs in these drier habitats. This one's primarily brought colour into hybrids, so we get that rich pink. Sometimes it can be white, sometimes it can be white with a reddish labellum, what we call the Sarcochilus variety. But the species itself, again, reasonably slow growing, has those pseudobulbs making it tolerant of drying conditions and water shortages over brief to lengthy drought periods. But also too, the plant can shed leaves and then grow new growth each year to start to take advantage of what opportunities there are to persist and go on. Bulbophyllum elisae is a much less frequently seen plant, and in a lot of ways can tell us a bit about the fire history of the site. They typically occur on granite boulders and sandstones, and you can see there's a little bit of granite just showing through there, but where they usually occur is on these patches of lichen and other moss type plants that occur on these boulders. They'll establish, they grow slowly, as you can see here. Sometimes the lichen starts to take them over, so that's how slowly they are growing. But they have fabulously large flowers for Bulbophyllum. This is probably a flower 40 to 50 mils across, but the business part is still quite small. The plants themselves yield us a bit of information about the fire history, because, as you can imagine, in a hot fire, that lichen burns, and it burns and boils the plants as well. So they only persist in a site where they can escape regular burning. Main concern I have is this year, most of the habitat for this species, certainly in northern New South Wales, has burnt. So it's going to be interesting to watch how well it recovers over the next decade or so. If we move into some of the drier rainforest types, this is a grey myrtle rainforest in a valley west of Sydney that flows into our water supply at Warragamba Dam. You can see here, the humidity is still around. There's plenty of growth on the ground. This is a grass called microlina, weeping grass, but there's also plenty of dichondra and ranunculus and various other things in this ground stratum. So we get enough light coming through that allows our ground orchids to persist. And this is a rich habitat for Pterostylis, Achianthus, Corybus, Kyloglottis, and other genera that we see around. In the trees, we'll get plants such as Sarcochilus hilii, Plectoryza tridentata again, and some of the more interesting epiphytes as well, some of the Dendrobium teretifolium relatives like Dendrobium fairfaxii, as well as one that I'll show in a little while, the cucumber orchid. Sarcochilus dilatatus is one of those plants that occurs in these drier rainforests, and in New South Wales is only known from 2 locations, one of which was annihilated by the fires in January. So we're hoping it still persists in small pockets nearby to there, but the other population about 20 kilometres away did manage to survive the fire. However, this is another one of these precocious species. It can grow quite quickly. It primarily occurs on a plant called hoop pine, which occurs in these dry rainforests. But hoop pine itself is now suffering because of the buildup of weeds such as lantana around the base, makes the whole habitat much more flammable. The plants themselves, actually these orchids occur quite frequently in hoop pine plantations in southeast Queensland. So the plant can establish in a cultivated sense on forestry situations. So as long as we have hoop pine plantations, the plants will persist, but we don't do too much in the way of hoop pine plantations in New South Wales. So we've got to rely on the natural habitats for them. Again, as I said, the habitat condition here, it's assessing the amount of weed extent and also too the frequency with which the habitat burns fiercely. This species was originally described in New South Wales from a specimen collected in 1896, was not seen again until I found it in 1999, and at the location that's now burnt. And there's another population, as I said, about 20 kilometres away, which was found in the mid-2000s. Sarcochilus hartmannii is another one of these species that has dual roles. It also is a listed threatened species. It's considered endangered in the wild, primarily because the plant is attractive to horticulture, so it was poached. The main habitats it's now restricted to are rocky outcrops where it grows in quite bright conditions. And as you can see, an upright grower, so it makes itself stand out and get noticed by poachers, which is beautiful. Of course, the flowers can be up to the size of a 50-cent piece and are very much contributed towards what we consider our best shapes for Sarcochilus hybrids coming from this hartmannii line. We move into the drier forest. So this is a gully in the Wattigan Mountains west of Newcastle. As you can see, it's sandstone communities. It's got sandstone plants, sandstone habitat plants within it, but occasionally a few dry rainforest things hang on, like this blueberry ash, Elisae. This habitat here, standing from this point here, I could count 6 orchids that I could see. Not all of them were terrestrials. There are 2 epiphytes that occur quite frequently in this habitat, Plectoriza again, and Dendrobium linguiforme. These sandstone gullies can be quite interesting. You'll get occasionally in the wetter spots plants like this Bulbophyllum shepherdii, and you can see there that plant has been growing for a long, long time to cover an area that's the better part of a metre across. And then you can get patches where you get a diverse array, and you can't really see these yellow names here, but each one of those is a different orchid species. In this square metre, there were 6 different orchid species. To give you an idea, this little Corybus unguiculatus is actually right there. That leaf is that leaf there, and here's the plant. What other things are there? There's another Corybus here, there's a Acanthamus here, there's Pterostylis nutans, the nodding greenhood up here, Pterostylis grandiflora here, and then a Calodini picta or catenata at the back. Other plants that can occur, which aren't necessarily a flower at this point in time, are things like the genoplesiums, which flower over summer when these habitats can be quite hot and quite dry, but you'll get sharp summer thunderstorms come through, and they have the habit of keeping the soil moisture up. Other things you'll get, as I said, Pterostylis grandiflora. It's growing in among this habitat here. It'll also grow quite happily, as you can see from the fern in the background, in wetter habitats as well. As we move into the more riparian forests, we end up in these she oak forests that are on some of the larger streams around Sydney. This habitat is also the place where I found 4 different epiphytic species growing quite happily and 6 different terrestrials. So it can be quite an orchid-rich habitat. But the thing to remember with sites like this is the reason there's not much shrub through this area is because when this creek floods, all of this goes underwater. So the orchids in this habitat are things like the Dendrobium linguiforme that I mentioned earlier, and which occurs on the rocks and sometimes on trees in these habitats. It was one of the first orchids described from the colony of New South Wales when it's found, and is still found, on the foreshores of Sydney Harbour. You can find plants in North Sydney if you know where you're looking. The form around Sydney is this white spidery form. Racemes can have 20 to 30 flowers on them, so they can be quite a good display on plants up to a metre across if you find them in places that not too many people have visited. The cucumber orchid, which I mentioned briefly before, is another one that occurs on those she oaks, where it occurs mainly on the underside of the branches, where it's getting the moisture that runs down the branch and then feeds or waters the plant, which is growing on the underside. Unlike most of the dendrobiums, this is an autumn flowering plant, so it'll flower at a time when others aren't in flower, which is a pity. It has started to contribute some towards our hybridizing, but mostly by chance of having a flower occasionally appear in spring and taking advantage of it. It is a big flower. It can be 4 to 5 centimetres across, and again has quite a rich scent. And you can see here why the other common name for it is the gherkin orchid. Those leaves are quite distinctive. If we move into the very drier forests, so we're here looking at what's called box gum grassy woodland, a critically endangered habitat that occurs in the wheat sheep belt of New South Wales, from the Queensland border right south through Albury and into Victoria. This site here is dominated by white box, this species here, Eucalyptus albans, yellow box, Eucalyptus meliodora, Eucalyptus blakeleyi, which there isn't one of in the shot. And you can see here we're quite close to a stream which has got casuarinas along it. Most of the orchids in this habitat are terrestrials. There's only one epiphyte that you're really likely to see that often, and that's this one, Cymbidium canaliculatum. This plant here, as you can see, is quite old. It's been persisting in this quite open habitat while the trees around it have been cleared or removed for agriculture. This is the typical colour form around northern New South Wales, the spotted brown and green form with the white labellum. Occasionally you'll get these lemony yellow to pale green forms with white labellums, an albinistic or flavidus form. But the issue I have with this plant, again, as I'm flagging here, it's a habitat condition flag. You don't see young plants around. We've got plenty of plants in these more open agricultural landscapes, but the plants themselves are not recruiting in this habitat. The only place I've ever seen recruitment of this species in the wild has been in areas where you get a more intact canopy. So some of the state forest areas where the canopy is still reasonably close to each other. So you're providing that additional humidity. The plants themselves, we call them an epiphyte, but in reality they're not. They're growing in the rotting heart of the tree. So they're an arboreal geophyte. They are a terrestrial orchid growing in a tree. So as long as the seedling can get its roots into that moist rot gut in the middle of the tree and get itself established for long enough, it has a chance of surviving. But the trouble is, we don't see too many of those trees around the landscape anymore where the plant persists, the tree persists for long enough for that rotting wood to develop, where it stays wet enough for long enough for the plant's seeds to germinate and grow sufficiently that the roots get down deeply enough into that rot gut to be able to allow the plant to survive the dry periods. This is a plant which I think is possibly on its way out as a naturally occurring plant, simply because we have too much of this agricultural landscape for it to be able to persist across as germinating plants, but also too, as we start to see the trend in rainfall in this sort of habitat, it becomes, while the rainfall values may not change that much, you'll get long periods of very dry conditions interrupted by short periods of very wet conditions, which aren't really conducive for the plant to survive, and in reality may even wash the seeds and the seedlings out of the nooks and crannies they get established into. But as I said, this habitat, the grassy box woodlands, are rich in ground orchids. So we can see here 3 variants, 3 different genera that occur in that habitat that I just showed you a minute or so ago. On the left, we have a donkey orchid. This is Diuris dendrobioides, which is found in northern New South Wales, one of the punctata and alba group of Diuris with purple and white flowers. We have one of the green comb spider orchids, Calodenia tentaculata, or a related species in this situation. This time they occur more in the areas where you start to see a bit of native pine, the calitris pine, start to develop, and the soils tend to be a little more sandy, whereas for the Diuris you can have quite a bit of clay in the soil. And when we look at the plant in the middle, the Dipodium, this is a good indicator that this habitat's in really good condition, because like all orchids, they rely on 2 other species to be able to persist, and possibly even 3 in this case. So the 2 species that all orchids are dependent on are the pollinator and the mycorrhiza, which provides the nutrients and moisture to the plant. In the case of the Dipodiums and the related mycoheterotrophic orchids, they're dependent on a 3rd other species, which is something that's providing the sugars to the mycorrhiza that the mycorrhiza then provides to the plant. In this case, the mycorrhiza may be harvesting the sugars out of the adjacent native sorghum grasses that you can see here with the ballerina skirts on the flowers, on the stem, sorry, or from the herbs or even the trees that we can see in the background. We don't really know well what the third species is that these the mycorrhizae are attaching to, and it is a rich field for research. If we come closer back to Sydney, we get into some of these habitats that show a bit more shrubbiness. So this is another critically endangered community called shale sandstone transition forest. It's listed both state and federal, so it's got quite a high ranking as far as communities occur, but it's also highly restricted in that it can only occur where the shale of Sydney just overlies the sandstone that surrounds it. So you get an enriched sandy clay loam soil which drains well, and also too, as you can see, provides a lot of opportunity for a diversity of plants to grow. Shrubs, herbs, forbs, ferns and grasses are all very richly and diverse found in this community. The community itself has a few orchids in the trees, particularly things like Cymbidium suave, but most of the diversity of orchids in this community is actually found in the terrestrials, where we have things such as the sun orchids, the finger calladenias or Cyanoculus ceruleum in this case, and even joys to find such as the flying duck orchid, although it's much more common on the sands and the sandstone soils that surround. Pterostylis saxicola is one of the orchids that's almost entirely restricted to this community in the shale sandstone transition forest. The species is listed as endangered, probably only known from half a dozen to 7 or 8 populations that occur on the western and southern edges of Sydney. But it's a good one that shows us not only that we need to look for these species and that they can tell us where the habitat's in better condition, but also too we can start to undertake things like population augmentation. So these plants have been grown from seed at the Australian Botanic Gardens at Mount Annan, one of the Royal Botanic Gardens group in Sydney. And these plants were being grown as part of their seed harvest. So they have the plant bank, the seed bank for New South Wales at this site. And every so often they have to germinate seed to ensure it's viable and that sort of thing. And with things like Pterostylis saxicola, they grow them on with the opportunity for us then to put them back into the habitat where these species occur to augment populations. If we look into even grassier communities, and we see here, this is a grassland up near Ebor at the back of Dorrigo, at the back of Coffs Harbour in the mid-north coast of New South Wales. This is quite high. This is 1,300 metres above sea level. The white-trunked trees in the background are snow gums. And this grassland here, although it's invaded by the American oxeye daisy, is probably a reasonably natural occurrence for this site. You get these occasional shallow soils where the basalt comes close to the surface. You get a rich clay soil at these sites, but also too, because of the frost hollow effect, the trees can't really establish. But these sites have, as you see, a lot of grass and quite tall grass growing on them. What that means is that the orchids that are growing in these sites need to also grow tall, erect racemes to get their flowers up to where they can be seen by the pollinators. So we have things like the sporanthes, the ladies' tresses growing where it's slightly damper, Prassophyllum, the leek orchids growing, as you can see there from the daisies in the background, quite out in the open, and then Microtus, which just seems to grow wherever it wants to, the soil is moist. All three of them show that classic habit of getting the flowers up and above the grasses to be able to be seen by the pollinators. Diuris eborensis is a species which is found only in this habitat. It's found at Ebor, at a number of sites, but also too in a couple of villages nearby. It's endangered. There's probably only 5 populations known. And as you can see, these are all the same species. It's highly variable in its flower. The trouble with this species is that it occurs mainly in what are called travelling stock roots. What that means is that as farmers are moving stock through these areas. The stock are grazing and browsing on these plants. And you can see here, this one thankfully was browsed before the racemes developed, but the leaves were all browsed off. The other thing that occurs in these areas is a lot of road works, and that leads to issues with regard to slashing and poisoning of weeds along roadsides. It can also affect these plants. When this soil is wet and you get the stock moving through, and you can have mobs of several hundred stock move through these sites, that also causes soil compaction and literally squashes the plants out of existence. We've tried to protect one of the main sites, which is on a major road intersection, but we haven't been successful as yet. So this brings us to the importance of propagation. I mentioned before with Pterostylis saxicola that we've ended up augmenting some of the natural populations. This is another threatened population, another threatened species. This is Diuris arenaria, which is found only in the Newcastle area. And these plants, as you can see, are growing in 75mm tubes at the Botanic Gardens. So these stems are up to almost 1 metre tall. Again, it's another one of these species that wants to get itself up above the ground cover grasses. And this one's even more interesting because the places where the species is seen to flower at its best is actually in power line corridors, because the trees and shrubs are kept down, so the plants are growing in a nice bright conditions in among dense grass sward and grow to their best. So why do we do this? We use it to bolster and augment our conservation populations. Where you get material being transplanted into a population, you can also end up with increasing the genetic diversity in that population, which makes it more tolerant to any habitat changes, whether they be from climate change or from weed invasion. And for some orchids, and Helene can certainly talk about how they do this in Victoria, it's a critical tool to get some of these plants out of a dire predicament and into slightly larger numbers by using augmented populations, growing some plants in cultivation, and then putting them back out into the wild. So as a summary for this talk, what are our take-home messages? Well, we should enjoy what these people are telling us about the environment in which they occur, and which hopefully we're getting out there to enjoy. We can see here from this Cymbidium suave, it's got a good crop of fruit growing on it. So it's obviously got a fairly active pollinator in this site. We can enjoy what they bring to us in their cultivation. So what we get out of not only growing the plants and hopefully flowering the plants, but also to what we get in the way of social liaison and collaboration with both people in the clubs, and also too, as you can see when we do our shows, with those people that we interact with in the public more generally. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you've put any questions into the chat